The snow fell heavy on the Montana mountains that December morning, blanketing the world in silence. For Marcus Bennett, a 38-year-old disabled veteran, this silence had become both comfort and prison. He stood on the wooden porch of his uncle's old lodge, leaning heavily on his cane, watching his German shepherd Riley bound through the fresh powder, with the kind of freedom Marcus could only remember having once. The thermometer mounted beside the door read -12 degrees Fahrenheit, but Marcus barely felt the cold anymore. The numbness in his residual limb meant temperature registered differently now, one of the many small adjustments that had become his new normal. His breath formed clouds in the crystalline air, each exhale a visible reminder that he was still here, still breathing, still fighting even when he wasn't sure what he was fighting for anymore. The inheritance had come as a shock. Uncle Robert had been a recluse, running this remote mountain lodge for 40 years, with barely a word to his family. Marcus had only met him twice in his childhood, vague memories of a tall, silent man with weathered hands and eyes that seemed to look through you rather than at you. The family had written Robert off as the eccentric hermit, the one who'd chosen mountains and solitude over family gatherings and holiday dinners. When the lawyer called 3 months ago to inform Marcus that he was the sole heir to the property, he'd felt more burden than blessing. The timing had been particularly brutal. He'd just been evicted from his Seattle apartment, the third place he'd lost in as many years. The landlord had been sympathetic but firm. The nightmares, the shouting that woke neighbors at 3 in the morning, the complaints that had stacked up despite Marcus's best efforts to manage his demons quietly, it all added up to someone nobody wanted as a tenant. His medical bills were piling up faster than he could count. The VA covered some things, but not others, and the gap between what he needed and what was provided had become a chasm he couldn't bridge on disability checks alone. Physical therapy, pain medications, the specialized prosthetic that actually fit properly versus the standard issue that rubbed him raw, it all cost money he didn't have. He'd maxed out 2 credit cards just trying to stay afloat, and bankruptcy felt like a looming inevitability rather than a distant possibility. But with medical bills piling up and his VE disability checks barely covering rent in his cramped Seattle apartment, the decision to move here had made itself. What choice did he have? At least here, there was a roof, walls, a place where his nightmares wouldn't get him kicked out. At least here, he could fall apart in private, with only the mountains as witnesses to his continued unraveling. If you're enjoying this story and want to hear more incredible tales of unexpected discoveries and life-changing moments, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us bring you these compelling stories every week. Marcus had lost his leg below the knee in Kandahar 7 years ago. The IED that took his leg had taken more than that. The memory of that day was seared into his brain with the kind of clarity that made forgetting impossible. He'd been leading a patrol through a village that intelligence had cleared as safe. Safe. The word was a joke now, a concept that belonged to people who'd never watched their world explode in a fraction of a second. He remembered the moment before, joking with Corporal Hayes about the care package Hayes had received from his girlfriend, full of homemade cookies that had arrived as crumbs but tasted like home anyway. He remembered the children playing in a doorway, the old man watching from a window, the smell of cooking fires and dust and diesel fuel. He remembered taking a step, just one more step in the thousands of steps a patrol required. Then nothing. A blank space where time should have been. He'd woken up in a field hospital in Germany 3 days later, his leg gone, his unit scattered, Hayes dead along with 2 others. The doctors had talked about how lucky he was, how the placement of the blast meant he'd kept his knee joint, how modern prosthetics would let him walk again, live a normal life. Lucky. another word that had lost all meaning. The physical recovery had been brutal but straightforward. Pain, therapy, learning to walk again, adjusting to a body that no longer worked the way his brain expected. He'd attacked it with the same discipline that had made him a good Marine, following every protocol, pushing through every exercise, determined to prove that he was still the same man, still capable, still valuable. But the invisible wounds were harder to navigate. The nightmares started in the hospital and never stopped. Every night he was back in that moment, taking that step, watching Hayes's face explode in slow motion, feeling the heat and pressure, and then nothing. He'd wake up screaming, sometimes thrashing so hard he'd fall out of bed, his heart hammering so fast he thought it might burst. The hypervigilance was constant. Loud noises sent him diving for cover. Crowds made his chest tight, his breathing shallow, his mind convinced that every person was a potential threat. He couldn't drive without checking every piece of roadside trash for wires, couldn't walk down a street without mapping exit routes and cover positions. His brain was stuck in combat mode, with no off switch, treating every moment as a potential ambush. The anger had come next, rising up from somewhere deep and primal. Anger at the insurgent who'd planted the bomb, at the intelligence that had cleared the route, at the politicians who'd sent them there in the first place. But mostly anger at himself, for surviving when better men hadn't, for being broken when he'd always been strong, for becoming someone he didn't recognize and couldn't respect. It had taken his career, his identity as a Marine, and for a long time his will to keep fighting. The Marine Corps was his family, his purpose, the lens through which he understood himself and his place in the world. Without it, he was adrift, a civilian in name but not in spirit, unable to connect with people who'd never worn the uniform, never made the choices he'd made, never carried the weight he carried. The transition to civilian life had been brutal. Jobs were scarce for a man who couldn't stand for long periods, who woke up screaming from nightmares, who flinched at loud noises. He'd tried warehouse work, but 12-hour shifts on his feet left him in agony, the prosthetic rubbing his stump raw no matter how carefully he'd adjusted it. He'd tried office work, but sitting all day brought its own pain, and the fluorescent lights and cubicle walls made him feel trapped, caged, his heart racing until he had to step outside just to breathe. Employers would hire him, sometimes out of genuine desire to help a veteran, sometimes to check a diversity box, but it never lasted. The sick days when the pain was too much, or the nightmares left him too exhausted to function safely. The moments when a car backfired and he'd hit the ground, embarrassing himself and scaring his co-workers. The distance he kept from everyone, the walls he couldn't let down even when he wanted to. Eventually, they'd find a reason to let him go, always legally defensible, always leaving him with one more failure to carry. His marriage hadn't survived the first 2 years back. Jennifer had tried, God knows she'd tried, but eventually the man she'd married had become a stranger even to himself. She'd been his high school sweetheart, had waited through 2 deployments before the one that broke him. She'd been at the hospital when he woke up, holding his hand, promising that nothing had changed, that they'd get through this together. But everything had changed. He couldn't be the husband she needed, couldn't provide for her the way he'd promised, couldn't even be present emotionally when his own emotions were a minefield he navigated minute by minute. She'd wanted to help, but he couldn't let her in, couldn't show her the darkness without feeling weak and ashamed. She'd wanted to understand, but how could he make her understand something he didn't understand himself? The fights had started small, about dishes or bills or his refusal to go to her office Christmas party, but they were never really about those things. They were about the fact that he wasn't the man she'd married, that she was living with a ghost who wore Marcus's face but couldn't access Marcus's heart. She'd cry, he'd shut down, and the space between them grew until it felt like they lived in different universes that occasionally, painfully, collided. When she finally left, He'd felt relief more than grief, relief that he didn't have to pretend anymore, didn't have to see his failure reflected in her disappointed eyes, didn't have to watch her sacrifice her happiness trying to save someone who might be beyond saving. The divorce was finalized 6 months later, papers signed through lawyers because they couldn't be in the same room without the weight of everything unsaid crushing them both. Riley had been the one constant. The service dog had been assigned to him 3 years ago through a veterans program, one of the few things the VA had gotten right. The German Shepherd wasn't just trained to help with physical tasks, picking up dropped items, providing stability when Marcus walked, opening doors and turning on lights, but also to sense when the panic attacks were coming, when the memories threatened to pull him under. The dog had an uncanny ability to read Marcus's physiology, detecting the elevated heart rate and changed breathing patterns that preceded an episode. Riley would press against him, grounding him, reminding him he was here, now, safe. The weight and warmth of the dog's body provided an anchor when Marcus's mind was trying to convince him he was back in Kandahar, that the danger was real and immediate. Riley had pulled him back from the edge more times than Marcus could count, had kept him breathing through panic attacks that felt like drowning on dry land. But it was more than the training. Riley was companion and confidant, the one being Marcus could be completely honest with, without fear of judgment or pity. He talked to Riley constantly, working through thoughts and feelings that he couldn't voice to another human. The dog listened without trying to fix anything, without offering platitudes about time-healing wounds or things happening for reasons. Riley just was, solid and present and absolutely loyal. The lodge itself was a testament to another era. Built in the 1950s, it had served as a hunting retreat for wealthy clients who'd pay good money to track elk and deer through these mountains. The main building was impressive, 2 stories of notched log construction with a massive stone fireplace dominating the great room. The ceiling soared 20 feet overhead, supported by hand-hewn beams that showed the marks of the tools that had shaped them. Large windows faced east and west, designed to capture both sunrise and sunset views of the mountain ranges. Robert had maintained it meticulously, but in recent years, as his health failed, bookings had dried up. The records Marcus found showed the decline, from full occupancy every season in the 70s and 80s to sporadic bookings in the last decade. The last guest had checked out 3 years before Robert's death. Since then, the lodge had stood empty, waiting, its silence growing deeper with each passing season. Now the lodge stood largely empty, its 10 guest rooms silent, its massive stone fireplace cold more often than not. Marcus had walked through those rooms his first day here, opening doors to spaces frozen in time. Each room was different, decorated with themes reflecting different types of hunts or different mountain regions. The furniture was solid, well-made, but dated. The bedspreads were clean but faded. Everything smelled faintly of cedar and age. Marcus had spent his first weeks here simply trying to understand what he'd inherited. The main building was solid, log construction that had weathered decades of harsh mountain winters. The logs were settling well, the foundation was level, the roof needed work, but the structure underneath was sound. Robert had known what he was doing when he'd built this place, or hired people who did. There was a separate cabin that had served as Robert's private residence, a 1-bedroom structure about 50 yards from the main lodge. Marcus had moved into it immediately, unable to face the emptiness of the main building with its ghost of hospitality past. The cabin was sparse but comfortable, with a wood stove for heat, a small kitchen that was more functional than fancy, and a bedroom barely large enough for a double bed and dresser. It felt right to Marcus, contained and manageable, unlike the sprawling lodge with all its empty rooms. The equipment shed was a large metal building, probably added in the 70s based on the construction style. Inside, Marcus had found decades of accumulated gear. Old hunting rifles, properly stored but covered in dust, racks of snowshoes and cross-country skis, ice fishing equipment, chainsaw and splitting maul for firewood processing. Maintenance tools for everything from plumbing to electrical work. It was like a museum of mountain life, everything you'd need to survive and thrive here, but all of it feeling abandoned, waiting for purpose. Several smaller outbuildings dotted the property. A smokehouse that hadn't been used in years, a root cellar built into a hillside, its thick stone walls maintaining constant cool temperature. A covered woodshed, half full of split logs that Robert must have prepared before his health failed completely. Each building told a story of self-sufficiency, of a time when running a remote lodge meant producing and maintaining everything on site. 20 acres of forest surrounded the property, with a creek running through the eastern edge that froze solid come winter. Marcus had walked the boundaries several times, using a property map he'd found in Robert's papers. The land was beautiful. Old-growth pines mixed with aspen and cottonwood, the understory thick with mountain shrubs. He'd seen deer tracks, elk sign, evidence of bears, though thankfully none of the bears themselves. The creek, when it wasn't frozen, ran clear and cold, fed by snowmelt from higher elevations. The nearest town, Whitefish, was 18 miles down a winding mountain road that became treacherous in winter. Marcus had made the drive twice since arriving, once to stock up on supplies, once to meet with the lawyer to finalize the estate paperwork. Both trips had exhausted him, the combination of physical pain and mental strain leaving him drained for days afterward. The first trip had been overwhelming. After weeks of seeing only forest and mountains, the town felt too bright, too loud, too full of people moving with purpose and confidence that Marcus couldn't muster. He'd stuck to his list, moving through the grocery store as efficiently as possible, avoiding eye contact, his hand tight on his cart for support when his prosthetic started to ache. People stared, some recognizing him as the stranger who'd inherited Robert's place, others just curious about the limping man with the service dog. He'd loaded his truck and left as quickly as possible, Riley sensing his distress and pressing close as they drove back up the mountain. The second trip, to finalize paperwork, had been different. The lawyer, an older woman named Patricia Morrison, who'd handled Robert's affairs for 30 years, had been kind but direct. She'd walked Marcus through every document, explained every clause, made sure he understood exactly what he was inheriting. Not just the property, but the debts too. Outstanding property taxes and utility bills, maintenance contracts that Robert had signed before his death. It wasn't overwhelming, Patricia assured him, but it wasn't insignificant either. She'd also shared stories about Robert, painting a picture of a man Marcus wished he'd known. Robert had been fair in his dealings, generous to locals who needed work, strict about maintaining the land properly. He'd had principles, refusing to allow hunting practices he considered unsporting, turning away clients who treated animals or land with disrespect. He'd been lonely, Patricia thought, but maybe that had been a choice, a deliberate solitude rather than an imposed isolation. Money was tight. Robert had left the property free and clear, but there was little in the way of cash. The estate had held less than $3,000 in a local bank account, barely enough to cover the first few months of utilities and property taxes. The lodge needed repairs. The roof leaked in 2 places where shingles had blown off during winter storms. The heating system was ancient and inefficient, a oil-burning behemoth that devoured fuel and produced uneven heat. And the whole place needed updating if Marcus had any hope of attracting guests in the modern era, where people expected Wi-Fi and updated bathrooms. Marcus had spent hours making lists, prioritizing repairs by urgency and cost. The roof had to be fixed before spring thaw caused more water damage. The heating system needed servicing at minimum, replacement ideally. The bathrooms were functional but grim, with fixtures from the 70s and tile that had been grimy for decades. The kitchen equipment was commercial grade, but outdated, and several appliances no longer worked. The electrical system needed inspection. Some of the wiring looked original to the 50s, and Marcus worried about fire risk. Every estimate he'd gotten from contractors had made his stomach sink. The roof alone would run $15,000. Heating system replacement was $20,000 or more. Bathroom renovations, even doing budget work, would eat up another $10,000 per room. And there were 4 guest bathrooms, plus the 2 in the main lodge common areas. The numbers added up to more than Marcus could earn in 5 years on disability, assuming he spent nothing on food or medical care or any other living expense. Marcus had considered selling, but the real estate agent he'd spoken to had been blunt. Her name was Carol Zhang, and she'd driven up from Kalispell to give him an honest assessment. She'd walked through the lodge, taking notes, her face carefully neutral, but her body language telling Marcus everything he needed to know. Remote properties were hard to move, especially ones that needed work. In the current market, he might get enough to cover a year or 2 of modest living, but then what? The property would appraise for maybe $200,000, she'd said, but finding a buyer would take time, possibly years, and that was if someone wanted a project, wanted to pour money and effort into bringing it up to modern standards. At least here, he had a roof over his head, space to breathe, and no neighbors to hear when the nightmares got bad. That counted for something, maybe everything. Marcus had woken up screaming at 2 a.m. his first night here, the dream vivid and terrible, but there'd been no pounding on walls, no angry voices telling him to keep it down, no worried knocks on the door from neighbors who didn't know whether to help or call the cops. Just silence, the house absorbing his pain without judgment. He'd established a routine, because routine was survival. Wake at dawn, usually from pain rather than alarm, his stump aching where the prosthetic had rubbed it raw the day before. Coffee first, strong and black, standing at the kitchen window watching light paint the peaks. Then care for the stump, checking for breakdown in the skin, applying the special cream his prosthetist had recommended, adjusting the sock layer to try to minimize friction. Breakfast was simple, oatmeal or eggs, eaten standing up because sitting then standing activated different pain patterns, and Marcus had learned to budget his pain carefully. Then the prosthetic, the process of donning it, something he'd gotten fast at but never easy. The pressure always there, the fit never quite perfect no matter how many adjustments he made. Some days it felt tolerable. Some days it felt like walking on broken glass with every step. He never knew which kind of day it would be until he tried. Riley needed his routine too, and Marcus built his day around the dog's needs as much as his own. Morning walk, the length depending on Marcus's pain levels and the weather. Riley would range ahead, checking the perimeter, making sure their territory was secure. The dog took his job seriously, investigating any new smells, alert to any changes from the previous day's patrol. After the walk, Marcus would tackle whatever project he'd set for himself. In the first weeks, it had been inventory, going through every room, every closet, every storage space, documenting what was there. He'd found treasures mixed with trash, vintage hunting gear worth money, mixed with broken furniture that needed hauling away. He'd found Robert's personal effects in the cabin, photograph albums that told the story of a life Marcus hadn't known about, medals from Robert's own military service in Vietnam that explained some of his uncle's understood reclusiveness. Marcus had started making small repairs he could handle himself, fixing a leaking faucet in the main lodge kitchen, replacing broken window screens, patching holes in walls where pictures had hung. It wasn't much, but it felt productive. each small fix a tiny victory against the overwhelming list of what needed doing. He watched YouTube videos to learn skills he'd never needed in the Marines: plumbing basics and electrical troubleshooting, drywall repair and door hanging. The days were long but structured: work until pain forced a break, rest with ice on his stump, then back to work. Lunch was often forgotten, Marcus losing track of time when focused on a task. Afternoons were for paperwork, the endless bureaucracy of settling an estate, managing his own VA claims, trying to understand what he'd inherited beyond just buildings and land. Evenings were the hardest. As darkness fell and the workday ended, there was nothing left but time and thoughts. Marcus would sit in Robert's cabin, Riley at his feet, and face the reality of his situation. He was 38, broken in body and spirit, sitting in the middle of nowhere, with no clear path forward. The weight of that reality pressed down like physical force, making it hard to breathe, hard to believe that tomorrow would be any different from today. He'd tried to reach out to other veterans he'd served with, guys who'd survived intact, who'd built lives after their service ended. The conversations had been painful, highlighting the gap between their experiences and his. They had careers, families, futures that looked bright. They'd say they understood, but Marcus could hear the discomfort in their voices, the relief that it was him dealing with this and not them. Eventually he'd stopped calling, stopped pretending that connection was possible when their lives had diverged so completely. It was Riley who first showed interest in the old equipment shed. 3 weeks into their stay, during one of their daily walks around the property, the dog had stopped at the shed's doors, whining and pawing at the weathered wood. Marcus had checked it before, finding only rusted tools, old hunting equipment, and stacks of mouldy boxes filled with paperwork from decades of lodge operations. But Riley was insistent, more focused than Marcus had seen him outside of his service duties. The dog kept returning to the same spot, a corner of the shed where wooden skis from the 60s leaned against the wall. Marcus had pushed them aside multiple times, finding nothing but bare wall and floor. Still, Riley wouldn't let it go. The dog would sit in that corner during their visits to the shed, looking up at Marcus with an intensity that seemed to communicate something important, something Marcus wasn't understanding. Marcus had tried to dismiss it, chalking it up to rodent activity or some scent marker he couldn't detect, but Riley's behavior escalated. The dog started refusing to leave the shed, whining when Marcus tried to call him away. It was unusual enough that Marcus started paying closer attention. Riley had never been obsessive about anything except his service duties. This behavior felt purposeful, deliberate, like when Riley alerted to an oncoming panic attack. The dog knew something Marcus didn't, and he was trying to communicate it the only way he could. The morning everything changed started like any other. Marcus woke at dawn, the phantom pain in his missing leg making sleep impossible after 5 a.m. He'd learned to work with his body's new rhythms, accepting the limitations even as he pushed against them. The phantom pain was particularly bad that morning. The sensation that his missing foot was cramping, that his absent toes were being crushed, that his gone calf was on fire. It made no sense, pain in body parts that no longer existed. But the brain didn't care about logic. The nerves fired and Marcus suffered. Coffee first, strong and black, standing at the kitchen window watching the sun paint the snow-covered peaks in shades of pink and gold. The view never got old, the vastness of it, the indifference of the mountains to human struggle. Marcus found comfort in that indifference. The peaks didn't care about his pain, didn't judge his failures, just existed in their ancient, eternal way. Riley needed his morning routine too. The dog had been restless during the night, and Marcus felt guilty. His own nightmares had been particularly bad, a variation on the usual where he watched the explosion in slow motion, trying to warn Hayes, but unable to move or speak, paralyzed while his friends died. Riley had done his job, pulling Marcus back from the edge, pressing against him until his breathing slowed and his heart stopped trying to pound through his chest. But it had disrupted the dog's rest too. A good long walk was in order, for both their sakes. They headed out into the crisp morning air, Marcus's breath forming clouds, his prosthetic leg performing adequately in the cold, though he knew he'd pay for the extended walk later with increased pain. The cold affected the fit, made the liner less flexible, increased the friction against his skin. But being outside, moving, doing something other than sitting in the cabin, dwelling on everything wrong with his life, that was worth the price. Riley ranged ahead, following scent trails only he could detect, occasionally circling back to check on Marcus before bounding off again. The dog's joy in simple movement was infectious, a reminder that not everything had to be complicated or painful. Sometimes a walk in the snow was just a walk in the snow, and that could be enough. When they reached the equipment shed, Riley made a beeline for that same corner. This time, his behavior was different. Instead of just pawing and whining, he began to dig, his powerful legs sending up sprays of the dirt floor. Marcus tried to call him off, his voice sharp with surprise and frustration, but Riley was in full working mode, the intensity he showed when alerting to one of Marcus's episodes. The dog wasn't being disobedient, he was working, and Marcus's training with service dogs had taught him to trust when Riley was alerting to something. Curious now, Marcus entered the shed and approached the corner. His prosthetic wasn't designed for uneven surfaces, and the dirt floor, now torn up by Riley's digging, made walking treacherous. He moved carefully, using his cane for balance, watching where he placed each foot. Riley had excavated a shallow depression, maybe 6 inches deep, dirt piled around the edges. In the dim light filtering through the dusty windows, Marcus saw something that made his heart quicken, a metal edge, barely visible beneath decades of packed dirt. Marcus knelt, the movement awkward and painful, his prosthetic not bending the way a real knee would. He brushed away more dirt with his hands, feeling the texture change from loose soil to packed earth to the rust-rough surface of metal. It was definitely something buried, deliberately buried based on the depth and the way the dirt had been packed down over it. His mind raced with possibilities. Old tools, buried trash, something valuable that Robert had hidden. It took Marcus 20 minutes to clear enough dirt away to see what Riley had found. A metal strongbox, roughly 2 feet long and a foot wide, its surface rusted but intact. It had no visible lock, just a simple latch that had corroded shut. The box was heavy when Marcus tried to lift it, dense in a way that suggested it wasn't empty. His hands shook, whether from cold, exertion, or anticipation he couldn't say. All three, probably, combined with a sudden surge of hope that he didn't want to let himself feel, but couldn't suppress. He carried the box back to the main lodge, Riley trotting alongside, tail wagging with what Marcus could swear was pride. The dog kept looking up at him, then at the box, then back at him as if to say, "I told you something was there, I tried to tell you." Marcus found himself talking to Riley as they walked, praising the dog, promising extra treats, his voice thick with emotion he didn't fully understand yet. In the kitchen, with better light and tools at hand, Marcus worked the latch free. The metal had fused with rust and time, and he had to use penetrating oil and patience, working it gradually, rather than forcing it and potentially breaking something. His hands were steady now, the shake replaced by focused intensity. This moment felt important in a way he couldn't articulate, potential concentrated in this corroded metal box. The hinges groaned in protest, but finally the lid opened. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected it from moisture, were stacks of cash, old bills, hundreds and fifties, bound with rubber bands that crumbled at his touch. The smell hit him, musty paper and old ink, the scent of hidden money. Marcus stared, his brain refusing to process what his eyes were seeing. It felt unreal, like something from a movie rather than his actual life. People didn't just find boxes of cash buried in sheds. This didn't happen. But it was happening. Marcus lifted out one stack, the bills crisp despite their age, wrapped tight enough that the bundle stayed together even when the rubber band disintegrated. He counted 20s, 50s, hundreds, all dated from the 70s through the 90s. Robert had been stashing cash for decades, pulling it out of circulation and storing it here, safe from banks and markets and anything else that might threaten it. Beneath the money, there were documents, stock certificates from companies Marcus recognized: IBM, Ford, General Electric, Microsoft from its early days, some that had appreciated dramatically over the decades, others from companies that no longer existed. Each certificate was in Robert's name, registered properly, waiting to be transferred to his heir. Marcus knew enough about investments to understand that some of these could be worth significant money, especially the technology stocks that had split and grown over the years. And at the bottom, a letter in his uncle's distinctive handwriting. Marcus set the stocks aside carefully and unfolded the letter, his hands trembling so hard he almost dropped it. The paper was yellow with age, creased from being folded, but the words were clear. "Marcus," the letter began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've found what I hoped you'd find. I should have made this easier, should have left you a map or at least a hint, but paranoia got the better of me in the end. I buried it deeper after my second heart attack, thinking I was protecting it, then worried I might not remember where. The mind plays tricks as you get older. I wrote this letter as insurance, hoping that even if I forgot, you'd somehow stumble across it. I've been a careful man my whole life, watched my father lose everything in bank failures during the Depression, even though I was just a child then. That fear never left me, so I squirreled away cash, never trusted banks entirely. Over 40 years of running this lodge, I kept back more than I needed, saved more than was probably wise. Every good season, I'd pull out some cash, add to this box. Every time the stock market crashed and everyone panicked, I'd buy stocks cheap, hold on to the certificates, and wait. I know you've been struggling. I kept track from a distance as much as I could, heard about your injury from your mother before she passed. God rest her soul. Heard about the divorce from your father before we stopped speaking entirely, my choice, not his. I know about the VA battles, the medical bills, the jobs that didn't work out. I wanted to help, wanted to reach out, but I respected that you needed to find your own way. We Bennett men are proud and stubborn, and sometimes that pride is all we have left. This inheritance isn't just the lodge, Marcus. It's a second chance, a foundation to build whatever life you can envision. I built this place with my own hands, with help from good men who've long since passed. It gave me purpose when I came back from Vietnam with my own demons. The mountains, the work, the solitude, they saved my life in ways I couldn't have explained to the family I left behind. I couldn't be the son my parents wanted, the brother my siblings expected. The war changed me too much. But up here, I could be useful. I could maintain something beautiful, create a space where others could find peace, even if I couldn't always find it myself. I hope you might discover something similar, though I hope your path is easier than mine was. There's also an apology I need to make. I should have hidden this strongbox somewhere more obvious, should have told someone where it was, should have made sure you'd find it without difficulty. But paranoia got the better of me in my final years. After the strokes, after my thinking got fuzzy, I worried about everything. I buried it deeper, changed the location from where it had been for decades, thinking I was being clever and protective. Then I couldn't remember if I'd actually done it or just thought about doing it. The mind is a terrible thing when it turns against you. I hope you found this quickly in your first weeks here, but if months or even years have passed, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for making things harder when I was trying to make them easier. I'm sorry for not being brave enough to have a relationship with you when I was alive, for letting my own damage keep me isolated when family needed family. I'm sorry for leaving you with property that needs work and not enough obvious resources to handle it. But most of all, I hope this helps. I hope you can use this to make the lodge work, or to walk away if that's what you need, or to build whatever life you can imagine. You survived a war, survived losing your leg, survived everything that came after. You're stronger than you know, stronger than I ever was. You deserve a chance to thrive, not just survive, and maybe this can help with that. One more thing, the property, the lodge, it has a way of becoming part of you if you let it. The mountains don't judge, don't care about your past or your mistakes. They just are, constant and patient and bigger than any one person's pain. If you stay, let the place work on you. It won't fix everything. God knows it didn't fix me. But it might give you space to figure out who you are now, not who you used to be or who you think you should be. Take care of yourself, Marcus, and if you have a dog, take care of them too. Dogs are better than people most of the time. Your uncle, Robert. Marcus read the letter 3 times, each reading revealing new layers of meaning. Robert had understood, in ways Marcus's own family hadn't, what it meant to come back broken. The old man had fought his own battles with his own demons, and somehow he'd found a way to keep going. Not perfectly, not without scars, but he'd kept going. And now he'd given Marcus the tools to do the same. Marcus counted the cash 3 times, unable to believe the figure. $43,000, not a fortune by modern standards, but more money than Marcus had seen in one place in his entire life. Combined with the stock certificates that he'd need to research but appeared valuable, it was enough. Enough to make the necessary repairs to the lodge. Enough to market it properly, to give it a real shot at becoming profitable. Enough to buy time, to breathe, to plan beyond just the next month's expenses. He sat on the kitchen floor, Riley pressed against his side, and for the first time in 7 years, Marcus Bennett cried. Not from pain or loss or frustration, but from relief, from possibility, from the overwhelming gratitude that somehow, despite everything, he'd been given another chance. The tears came hard, shaking his whole body, years of held emotion finally breaking through the walls he'd built. Riley pressed closer, whining softly, doing his job, even as Marcus did something he'd been unable to do since losing his leg. He let himself feel hope. Tentative, fragile, easily crushed, but real. Hope that maybe, just maybe, he could build something from the ruins of his old life, that maybe Uncle Robert was right, that he was stronger than he knew, that surviving meant something. The weeks that followed were a blur of activity. Marcus hired contractors from Whitefish to repair the roof, upgrade the heating system, and renovate the bathrooms. He was careful in his hiring, meeting with each contractor personally, asking for references, checking their work on other properties. He couldn't afford mistakes, couldn't afford to trust the wrong people with this opportunity. The contractor who impressed him most was a man named Jim Crawford, a Vietnam veteran who'd been running his own construction company for 30 years. Jim understood old buildings, respected what Robert had built, and wasn't trying to talk Marcus into unnecessary upgrades or trendy features that would look dated in 5 years. They'd spent hours going over the lodge, Jim pointing out what needed immediate attention versus what could wait, explaining options and costs in plain language. The roof work started first, a crew of 4 men working through late winter weather to replace damaged sections and reinforce the entire structure. Marcus watched them work, fascinated by the skill involved, the way they moved on steep pitches with confidence born of experience. He found himself thinking about offering to help, but his prosthetic made ladder work impossible, and he wasn't about to become a liability on a job site. The heating system was next, replacement rather than repair, proving more cost-effective in the long run. They ripped out the old oil furnace and installed a modern propane system with programmable thermostats in each room. The difference was immediate. Even heat throughout the building, fuel costs dropping by more than half, and no more waking up to frozen pipes in guest rooms that hadn't been used. Bathroom renovations took longer, each one requiring weeks of work. They kept the original footprints, but updated everything else. New tile, modern fixtures that conserved water, better lighting, ventilation fans that actually worked. Jim suggested keeping one bathroom mostly original as a nod to the lodge's history, and Marcus agreed, letting that one keep its vintage charm while making sure it functioned properly. He researched the stock certificates and discovered that several had split multiple times over the decades. Their current value was substantial, enough that he could think long-term, could plan for a sustainable future rather than just survival. The Microsoft stock alone, purchased in the mid-80s before the company became a household name, had appreciated to the point where Marcus had to sit down and recount the numbers multiple times to believe them. He set up a meeting with a financial advisor in Kalispell, a woman named Susan Parker, who specialized in helping veterans manage their finances. She'd reviewed his situation with the kind of thorough attention that made Marcus trust her immediately. She recommended selling about 40% of the stocks to fund the renovations and build an operating reserve, while holding the rest as long-term investments. Diversification, she'd called it, not putting all your eggs in one basket. But Marcus was careful. His time in the military and his struggles afterward had taught him the value of preparation, of not being reckless, even when resources seemed abundant. He sold some stocks to fund the immediate renovations, but held others as a safety net. The cash he divided, some for operating expenses, some into a savings account he swore he'd only touch in true emergency. He'd been broke too many times to be careless with money, even when it felt like he finally had enough. He also began to truly explore his uncle's records. The boxes in the equipment shed, once ignored, now revealed a detailed history of the lodge's operations. Robert had been meticulous, keeping logs of every guest, every hunt, every expense and income. Marcus pored over these records, learning what had worked, what hadn't, what guests had valued most. One theme emerged clearly. The hunters who'd returned year after year, who'd booked the lodge decades running, hadn't just been after game. They'd been seeking escape, a place removed from the pressure and noise of their lives. They'd valued Robert's quiet competence, the quality of the experience, the sense of stepping into a simpler time. Marcus realized he could offer something similar, but updated for a new generation. Not hunting, necessarily, though that could remain an option, but retreat. A place for veterans, for people dealing with trauma, for anyone who needed space to heal. He knew that world intimately, knew what was needed, what helped and what didn't. The idea took root and grew. Marcus began reaching out to veterans organizations, proposing the lodge as a retreat space. He emphasized the quiet, the natural setting, the opportunity for outdoor activities like hiking and fishing that research showed helped with PTSD recovery. He kept the rates modest, intent on accessibility rather than profit. Response was immediate and overwhelming. Within a month, he had bookings stretching into the next year. Veterans groups wanted to bring members for weekend retreats. Individual vets, hearing about the place through the grapevine, reached out asking about longer stays. Some were in crisis, at the edge of where Marcus himself had been, needing a place to step back and breathe. Marcus hired help, 2 other veterans from the area, both dealing with their own transitions to civilian life. Tom had been Army, lost hearing in one ear from repeated mortar fire, struggling to find employers willing to accommodate his disability. Sarah was Air Force, no visible injuries, but carrying trauma from what she'd witnessed in field hospitals overseas. Both understood the mission Marcus was building without him having to explain. Together, they transformed the lodge, Guest rooms were updated but kept simple, comfortable rather than fancy. The common areas were arranged to encourage interaction but also respect privacy. They added a small library, stocked with books on everything from wilderness survival to meditation to military history. The massive stone fireplace became the heart of the space, where guests gathered in evenings to talk or simply sit in companionable silence. Riley became the lodge's unofficial mascot. The German Shepherd seemed to understand his role had expanded beyond caring for just Marcus. He'd greet arriving guests with gentle enthusiasm, seemed to sense who needed space and who needed attention. More than once, Marcus watched Riley approach a guest sitting alone, the veteran's face suggesting they were losing a battle with dark thoughts, and simply lay down beside them, offering his solid, warm presence. The first real test came in March, when a group of 6 Marines arrived for a week-long stay. They were all Iraq veterans, all dealing with varying degrees of PTSD, all at different stages of accepting help. Marcus recognized himself in each of them: the anger, the isolation, the bone-deep weariness of fighting invisible battles every day. He didn't try to be their therapist or their drill instructor. He simply provided space, structure, and understanding. Morning hikes, optional but encouraged. Communal meals where conversation flowed naturally. Evening time around the fire where stories emerged organically, not forced but welcomed. During the day, activities like chopping wood, basic repairs around the property, tasks that were physical but not overwhelming, that provided a sense of accomplishment. One of the Marines, a young corporal named Davis, who'd lost 3 friends to a roadside bomb, had been silent for the first 3 days. He went through the motions, participated minimally, his eyes holding an emptiness Marcus knew too well. Davis was 26, but looked older, the weight of survivor's guilt aging him in ways that had nothing to do with years. He'd eat when food was put in front of him, join the hikes when they started, but his presence felt hollow, like he was watching his own life from a great distance. On the 4th day, during a hike to the ridge overlooking the valley, Davis stopped at the summit. The rest of the group had continued on, giving him space without making it obvious, a courtesy born of shared understanding. Nobody pushed, nobody asked intrusive questions. They just let each person move at their own pace. The view was spectacular. Mountains rolling away in every direction, the sky impossibly blue, the air so clean it almost hurt to breathe. Snow still capped the highest peaks, but lower down, spring was asserting itself, patches of green emerging where the sun hit strongest. A hawk circled overhead, riding thermals, its shadow moving across the valley floor thousands of feet below. Davis stood there for long minutes, Riley sitting beside him, Marcus hanging back to give him space, but close enough to reach him if needed. Marcus had learned to read body language, to distinguish between someone who needed solitude and someone who was circling the drain of a dark decision. Davis was on the edge. Marcus could feel it, that moment where pain either breaks you completely or forces you to start building something new. Then Davis spoke, his first words beyond basic necessities since arriving. His voice was rough, like he'd forgotten how to use it. He talked about the guilt, about being the one who'd survived when better men hadn't. Better Marines, he kept saying. Guys with families, with futures, with people who needed them. He'd been the junior guy, the one still figuring things out, and somehow he'd lived while they'd died. He talked about the anger at a world that kept spinning while his had stopped. People laughing, shopping, complaining about traffic, living their lives like it mattered, like any of it mattered, when good men were bleeding out in dirt half a world away. He couldn't connect to that world anymore, couldn't pretend to care about normal problems when he knew what real problems looked like. And he talked about the fear, the constant gnawing fear that this emptiness was all that was left of him, that the person he'd been before, the kid who'd enlisted believing in service and honor and making a difference, was gone forever. that there was nothing to build on, no foundation left intact, just rubble and ruin, and the question of whether it was worth trying to build anything at all. Marcus listened, said little, just validated what Davis was feeling. He didn't offer platitudes about time healing or finding new purpose or any of the empty phrases people used when they didn't know what else to say. He just acknowledged that Davis's pain was real, that his fear was justified, that survival didn't automatically come with meaning or purpose or any of the things that made life worth living. But Marcus also shared his own story, not as a lesson, but as testimony. He talked about his own spiral after losing his leg, the jobs that hadn't worked, the marriage that had failed, the nights when ending things had seemed like the most logical solution to an unsolvable problem. He talked about Riley finding the strongbox, about Uncle Robert's letter, about the grace of being given resources and opportunity when he'd expected nothing but more struggle. He told Davis that healing wasn't about going back, about recovering what was lost. That person was gone, that life was over, and pretending otherwise was just setting yourself up for more pain. Healing was about accepting what you'd become and figuring out how to live as that person, broken parts and all. It was about finding purpose in the wreckage, building something new even when you weren't sure what you were building or why. Later, back at the lodge, Davis joined the evening conversation for the first time. It wasn't dramatic. He didn't have some breakthrough moment or sudden revelation. He just participated a little bit, enough to be part of the group, rather than isolated in his own head. He told a story about his drill instructor, something funny from basic training, and when the others laughed, he almost smiled. Almost. Over the next days, Marcus watched Davis begin to engage. Small things, offering to help with dinner preparation, asking one of the other Marines about his deployment, sitting with the group instead of disappearing to his room immediately after meals. It wasn't recovery. Marcus knew better than to call it that, but it was movement. Forward, sideways, it almost didn't matter as long as it wasn't the downward spiral that had brought Davis here in the first place. By the time the group left, something had shifted. Not fixed, Marcus knew healing wasn't linear or simple, but shifted. The weight they'd all been carrying seemed a little lighter, or maybe they'd just gotten a little stronger at bearing it. They'd made plans to return, talked about bringing others, about spreading the word. Davis had shaken Marcus's hand, held eye contact for the first time all week, said simply, "Thank you for understanding." 2 words, but they carried the weight of everything that didn't need to be said. As spring moved into summer, the lodge found its rhythm. Groups came and went. Individuals stayed for weeks at a time. The property came alive with activity and purpose. Marcus hired more help, including a part-time cook, a retired army sergeant who'd worked in military kitchens for 20 years and knew how to feed people in a way that felt like care rather than just sustenance. The financial pressure eased. The lodge wasn't making Marcus rich, but it was sustainable, generating enough income to cover expenses and pay his small staff fairly while still keeping rates accessible. The remaining stocks from Robert's strongbox provided security, a buffer against unexpected costs or slow periods. Marcus found himself settling into a life he'd never imagined possible. The pain from his injury remained, some days worse than others, but it was manageable. The nightmares still came, but less frequently, and when they did, he had tools to deal with them, including a support network of people who understood without explanation. He'd started seeing someone, a physical therapist from Whitefish named Andrea, who'd worked with veterans before. She'd come up to the lodge initially on a professional basis, providing therapy sessions for guests who needed it. The connection between her and Marcus had been gradual, built on mutual respect and understanding rather than flash. They took it slow, both carrying enough baggage to know better than to rush. In late summer, Marcus received a call from his ex-wife, Jennifer. They hadn't spoken in over 2 years, the divorce having been finalized with lawyers as intermediaries, both too hurt and angry for direct communication. Her voice on the phone was hesitant, asking if they could talk. She drove up the following weekend. The conversation was awkward at first, years of pain and disappointment hanging between them. But gradually, sitting on the porch with coffee, watching Riley play in the creek, they found their way to honesty. Jennifer apologized for leaving when she did, admitted she hadn't been strong enough to handle his trauma on top of her own fear and hurt. Marcus apologized for shutting her out, for making her the enemy when she'd only been trying to help in the only ways she knew. They talked about what might have been different if they'd had better support, better understanding of what he was dealing with. They didn't rekindle anything romantic. Too much had happened. They'd both moved on, but they found a kind of peace, a closure that let them remember the good parts of what they'd had without the bitterness that had defined their ending. Jennifer left with a hug, wishes for his continued success, and the suggestion that maybe they could be friends eventually if he was open to it. As fall arrived, painting the mountains in gold and crimson, Marcus stood on the same porch where he'd first arrived nearly a year ago. Riley was beside him, grey starting to show around the dog's muzzle, but still strong, still focused on his job. The lodge behind them was full, 8 rooms occupied by veterans at various stages of their own journeys. Marcus thought about the path that had led him here, the injury that had ended his military career, but eventually pointed him toward a different kind of service. The dark years of struggle that had taught him empathy and resilience. The unexpected inheritance that had seemed like a burden, but proved to be salvation. And Riley, the dog who'd not only saved his life repeatedly, but had literally sniffed out the fortune that made all this possible. He'd learned that healing wasn't about going back to who you were before. That person was gone, changed fundamentally by trauma and experience. Healing was about accepting who you'd become, finding purpose in the broken places, using what you'd survived to help others survive their own battles. The lodge had become more than a business or a home. It was a mission, one that gave Marcus's life meaning beyond just getting through each day. Every veteran who found some peace here, who left a little more whole than when they'd arrived, validated the journey, proved that surviving wasn't enough. You had to find reason in the survival, build something from the ruins. Marcus had started writing, documenting his experiences and those of his guests, with their permission, not for publication, just for processing, for understanding. But his therapist, who he still saw regularly via video calls, had suggested that maybe sharing these stories could help others, that the journey from broken soldier to this moment might offer hope to people still in the dark. He wasn't sure about that yet. The idea of putting his pain and recovery out for public consumption felt exposing, but he was learning to sit with discomfort, to recognize that growth often required moving beyond what felt safe. The first snow of the season began to fall as Marcus stood there, fat flakes drifting down in the afternoon light. Riley lifted his head, watching the snow with the calm acceptance of a dog who'd seen seasons change, and trusted that each brought its own gifts. A guest emerged from the lodge, a Navy vet named Martinez, who'd been staying for 2 weeks, working through anger issues that had cost him his job and nearly his family. Martinez had been quiet, surly even for the first week, but yesterday, during a fishing trip, he'd opened up about the incident that had triggered his referral here, how close he'd come to doing something he couldn't take back. Martinez approached the porch, standing beside Marcus in silence for a moment. Then he spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I'm ready to go home," he said, "to face my family, to do the work. This place, what you've built here, it showed me there's a way forward, that I'm not alone in this." Marcus nodded, understanding the courage that statement required. "You've got my number," he said. "Bad days are gonna come. When they do, call. Come back if you need to. This place isn't a fix, it's a resource. Use it." Martinez clasped his shoulder, held it for a moment, then headed back inside. Marcus watched him go, feeling the weight and privilege of being trusted with someone's healing journey. As darkness fell and the temperature dropped, Marcus called Riley inside. The lodge was warm, the smell of dinner cooking filling the air. In the common room, several guests were gathered around the fireplace, their conversation a low murmur. Others were in their rooms, taking the solitude the lodge offered. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new struggles, new small victories. But tonight, Marcus was exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what he was meant to do. The fortune Riley had found in the snow hadn't just been cash and stocks. It had been possibility, the means to build a life of purpose from the ruins of his old one. It had been the key to helping others find their own paths forward. He settled into his chair by the fire, Riley at his feet, and let himself feel something he'd thought lost forever. Contentment. Not happiness exactly, that was too simple for the complexity of his life. But contentment, the deep satisfaction of living with purpose, of making a difference, of having survived the worst and used it to build something meaningful. The snow continued to fall outside, covering the world in fresh white, erasing tracks and starting everything clean again. Inside the lodge, veterans who'd fought in distant wars found a moment of peace. And Marcus Bennett, disabled veteran, accidental lodge owner and proof that second chances could emerge from the unlikeliest places, simply breathed and let himself be grateful for this moment, this life, this unexpected grace.